Welcome back to the Jane Austen Summer Program Jane Eyre vlog series. I am your co-host, Sarah Hurley, and with me as always.
I'm Nadea Pugh. I'm Sarah's co-host, and I'm so excited to be here again. Today we're going to be talking about chapters 10 through 17 of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre.
Some very exciting things have happened. I know I've already read it before, so I kind of had an idea, but it was a really fun refresher because it's been a minute. But Nadea has not read them before, so why don't you give everybody a little summary about what happens?
I would love to do that. Yeah, so chapter 10, we pick up right at the end of Jane's time at the Lowood school. She gives us kind of a quick summary of the 8 years that she skips, that she neglects, just chooses not to narrate. And during these 8 years, the school undergoes a lot of changes because um, it's everyone learns that Mr. Brocklehurst is kind of not a great guy. And so some better suited people swoop in to take charge and make sure the education is better, to make sure that the children are being fed, that sort of thing. And he's reduced to a treasurer position, which is good for everyone else. Miss Temple leaves the school, which is really sad. Especially sad for Jane because Jane was so close to Miss Temple. And so once Miss Temple leaves, Jane kind of feels like she has no one left that's really close to her at the school. And she's very lonely. Um, she spends six more years as a student at the Lowood School, and then she spends 2 years as a teacher there, which I thought was really fun to see her kind of level up in that way.
She publishes like a self-advertisement in the paper, and then she gets a response for her advertisement.
And this response comes from Thornfield in Millcote. Um, am I saying that right?
I don't know. It's
Okay.
no, it's also like British people, so it could just as easily be like Milcot or
That's
Milkit.
what I
I
thought. Millcote.
I don't
We all
know
gotta just speak in a British accent when we do this.
linguistic
He
practices and
receives an
British.
invite from Millcote. Um, and the um Mrs. Fairfield is inviting her to come be a governess at Thornfield. So Jane accepts this invite. She leaves the Lowood school, but before she leaves the Lowood school, Bessie comes and visits. Bessie has since left the Reeds. She doesn't live there anymore. She's married. She's moved out. And she kind of tells Jane about like what she's missed. So about how the Reeds are doing. Um, the hang on, I have notes in my I have like three notebooks where I was taking notes, doing my best. So Bessie kind of tells Jane about what the Reeds have been up to in the 8 years or the several years that Jane's been gone. Um, I remember notably that John Reed was not doing very well. He was expelled from school for failing exams and then causing his mom a lot of trouble just because he was spending all this money and being like not the most upstanding citizen. Um, and so that was fun for me to read about, to know that this character who kind of needed to learn a lesson was hopefully learning those lessons, at the very least paying consequences. But Bessie visits and um, she updates Jane on everything she's been missing, and then Bessie has to leave. And then soon after Bessie leaves, Jane leaves the Lowood school as well. Um, and she's still friendless up until this point. So the visit from Bessie was very nice, but she soon leaves Lowood, as I've said 5 times. um, and she ventures to Millcote, perhaps. Um, who's to say? Um, but she ventures there, and once she first arrives, she doesn't go directly to Thornfield. She arrives kind of in the town. Um, but there's no one there to receive her right away, so she spends a night there. And then she's getting very worried. She's very anxious about um kind of this future that she has laid out for herself, just because there is so much unpredictability as she learns kind of when there's no one expecting her when she first arrives. But the morning after, she is picked up by John, who is a servant for Thornfield, and he drives her to the estate, and she's received very warmly, which I thought was very pleasant. Um,
Who receives her very warmly?
Mrs. Fairfax,
Hmm.
who we come to learn later is not the owner of the estate, but Jane is under this assumption that Miss Fairfax is the proprietor and that she's in charge of everything. Um, but she receives Jane very warmly, which Jane is very appreciative of. We also meet Adele and Sophie. Adele is the little girl who Jane is going to be a governess for, and Sophie is Adele's nanny. And they're both French, so there was a lot of French in these 8 chapters that we read for today, which I thought was really fun.
Because Nadea knows French, and
No, this is a strong word.
I also did not take the pains to translate it. I just skimmed through, and in my head, I was saying blabbity blabbity blue for all of the French lines.
I get, and yeah. Um, yeah, so Adele and Sophie are French, and it is very fortunate for them that Jane is fairly fluent in French as well. From her time at the Lowood school, she can read and write and speak French very well, which is good because Sophie speaks no English, and Adele's English is very broken. We don't meet the infamous Mr. Rochester yet, but we hear about him because Adele gets very excited that Jane can speak French, and she goes on and on and on about her backstory and how she knows Mr. Rochester, and kind of gives us some information on him, talking about basically how Adele used to live in France, but for reasons not yet explained, Mr. Rochester kind of invited her to come with him to England. But then Adele's a little upset because she says that he invited her to come to England and she lives here now, but he is not here often, and that does not please her very much. But she's a very fun character. I thought she was really sweet. We also get hints at the end of chapter 11 that there might be some sort of gothic, haunted, ghostly vibes at Thornfield. This reminded me a lot of Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, just because every sort of suspicion that Jane has that there might be something supernatural is like fairly rapidly disproven. She thinks there is like a ghost upstairs because she hears like, this is the chapter where she hears laughter and thinks there's a ghost? Or is
Yes,
that
is yes, just chapter 15. Um, it says this was a demonic laugh, low, suppressed, and deep, uttered as it seemed at the very keyhole of my chamber door, late, late at night. And that's Jane talking. So it's kind of that hallmark of the Gothic novel, especially in that era, to have this very supernatural, sinister undertone. Usually that's later proven to have an earthly material um like actual source. So it will be interesting to see how this very ghostly experience Jane is having here in the early chapters of the book will continue to morph and develop as we move through the chapters.
I thought that was really fun though, that she kind of it was interesting to me because we're the novel's written from this kind of reflective perspective. Um, so I guess an older version of Jane is looking back on these ghostly things, and kind of, I don't know, not writing them off, but poking a little fun at her past self, I think, for having all of these ghostly suspicions.
There's even a conversation beforehand between Jane and Mrs. Fairfax, and that would be
Is
in
that the one of chapter
chapter
11?
11.
Okay,
Yes,
that's the one. Yeah.
where Jane is asking about the servants. Do they sleep in these rooms? And Mrs. Fairfax says, no, they occupy a range of smaller apartments to the back. No one ever sleeps here. One would almost say that if there were a ghost at Thornfield Hall, this would be its haunt. And Jane says, so I think you have no ghost then. And Mrs. Fairfax says, none that I have ever heard of. Jane says, nor any traditions of one, no legends or ghost stories. And Mrs. Fairfax is like, nah, girl, you're being a Lulu, forget it. No ghosts here, tee hee hee, but what about other things? Anyway, so yeah, it's funny to see how we've already got her questioning about could there be something lurking in the shadows? And then when we've got this demonic laugh at her keyhole, she's letting her imagination kind of run wild, a bit like Catherine Morland, like you were saying.
Well, I thought it was interesting because she has these like delusions of ghostliness or whatever. And then in chapter 12, we kind of see that Jane's been at Thornfield for a little bit of time, and she's already growing bored by this easy, simple, comfortable life. Which I thought, I don't know, that was really, really interesting to me that she's like, because there's a point as well where she mentions, I believe, she's like, I know you're going to think that I'm ungrateful for saying this, but I'm so bored with my easy life now.
And so then I think that might contribute to some of her infatuation with Mr. Rochester when he finally does arrive on the scene. What do you think?
I think so, definitely, because she meets him without knowing that it's him, but she meets him in that same chapter because she goes for a walk to town to deliver some mail, I believe. And she comes across I cannot pronounce this name of, but there's like a dog that runs up and it's black and white and it reminds her of a dog from a tale that Bessie used to tell her. The guy, G. G-Trish? G, how do you pronounce?
What?
It's like the Gytrash.
Wait, where is this?
She's when she like meets him and she's like on her walk and the dog comes up to her first and she thinks it's like, or it reminds her at least of this creature from
Yeah,
the tales
pilot.
Beth tell her. Yeah,
Isn't hold on. Which chapter are you in?
chapter 12, she thinks it's like some creature thing at first. Or I don't know if she actually believes
Guy
it,
Tra-
but Gytrash?
Guy Trash is like my
Gytrash.
guess. That is my educated guess.
Okay. Yeah, so
However, if we're butchering it, please let us know in the comments. We
mhm.
are but girls.
We're just girls.
I don't know, Guy Trash. Guy Trash.
Gytrash. Can I get a language of origin? Like some hint, something.
Some drop a pronunciation guide.
Yeah.
And
But yeah, so this dog, the dog's name is Pilot, so I'll just use that. Pilot runs up to her, and then moments later is followed by a rider on his horse, and then the horse falls and the rider falls as well. Um, and Jane doesn't know this yet, but this is Mr. Rochester. She sticks around kind of to make sure that he's okay and can get up. Her reasoning I thought was also very interesting because she says in like her narration that she would have left if he had like been nicer, I think, but because he was like so firm and stern and like not exactly polite that she stuck around. Unless I'm getting that mixed up, but I remember that being the her reason given for why she stayed to assist him. She also, I remember she said that she would have left if he was kind of like a handsome hero type, but he wasn't, so she stayed.
yeah, she was like, he is ugly for real, and I want all of you to know it. Hold on, let me pull up one of these descriptions because she's brutal. She is absolutely brutal. I think one of my favorites was, let's see, it is so funny. Most true is it that beauty is in the eye of the gazer. My master's colorless olive face square, massive brow, broad and jetty eyebrows, deep eyes, strong features, firm, grim mouth, all energy, decision, will, were not beautiful, according to rule, she says. But they were more than beautiful to me. They were full of an interest and influence that quite mastered me, that took my feelings from my own power and fettered them in his. So she always sort of, I guess, brings,
Yeah.
I don't know, she always sort of mitigates her, like, yeah, this man, he's an uggo. He's so ugly. Nobody's gonna put him on the cover of a magazine. He's just not it. He is no Mr. Darcy. Um, that is such a funny dynamic to see someone, to see a man. Imagine you're an 18-year-old girl, okay? And you've been at a boarding school with other girls your whole life. You've like barely ever met a man. Your only experience with a man is like Mr. Brocklehurst and your cousin who literally abused you. And you see the ugliest man alive and you're like, I want him. Imagine.
Him. I choose him.
Anyway, I think she was just so bored with her life.
I was gonna say that kind of, I feel like every girl knows that experience where nothing else is going on in your life and you just need a little crush.
See, everybody needs, I'm going to be so controversial, but everybody needs a silly little situational crush. Like, you need a little crush no matter where you are, just keep things interesting. I mean, like, not everybody does, clearly, but like, I do. Not that I actually want to date any of them, but it's just so fun to be a little bit delusional in your head when you know nothing's going to happen. It keeps you excited to go to class or to go to work or wherever you're doing or wherever you're going, whatever you're doing. It's fun.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Jane really is embodying that right now.
So I definitely think that part of her Rochester infatuation is I am in the country and there is nobody to talk to. And here's a man and he's weird and I am intrigued.
Yeah, my copy has so many like footnotes and stuff in the back, and there were so many references that I never would have caught otherwise. But like quotes either from the narration or in lines of dialogue that were references to. Like I noticed a lot of references to the Bible, references to Paradise Lost. There were a couple of those as well. Um, yeah, the Bible, Paradise Lost, a lot of Shakespeare too, which I thought was really fun. But it just even like when they show up in the narration, I feel like it shows just Jane is such she's such a reader, she's such a little scholar, a little intellectual, like
She does kind of like go off to Thornfield and immediately start pining after this man that's ugly and mysterious and unknowable. But she does sort of also have this really deep rooted inner yearning for freedom and emancipation from these structures that she's been forced into all of her life. A passage that really, really struck me was, let's see, chapter 12, kind of early in the chapter when she says, this is when she's still contemplating, leaving Lowood and embarking on a new adventure by herself into uncharted waters. She says, it is in vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action and they will make it if they cannot find it. And then she goes on a little bit to say, women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a constraint to absolute stagnation precisely as men would suffer, and it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. And I was just floored when I read that. I mean, obviously I've read it before, but I didn't remember that particular passage. And it struck me so strongly because what a radically feminist thing to say. especially for this time period. Like, obviously, now we're going to be like, yes, women can do whatever men can do. We can do whatever we want. And that's awesome. But this was also the 1800s. This was the 19th century. And a lot of Charlotte Bronte's life was making puddings and knitting stockings and playing the piano and embroidering and all of this sort of domestic housework, these more trivial pursuits, which, I don't think they're necessarily trivial. They've only been sort of described as trivial because in society, traditionally, women's activities like sewing and cooking, they've been sort of they've
They
been devalued because they're traditionally feminine activities. And if it's something that a woman's doing every day, then clearly it's not important. It's frilly, it's non-essential, it's a woman's work, and it's just something that they got to do. It's not like changing a tire, which is super skilled, manly. If you know how to change a tire, you're everything. You're Superman. But if you're a woman and you know how to make the best coconut pie on the block, you're just a woman.
Mhm.
So I think it's like these trivial womanly pursuits were primarily Charlotte Bronte's and her sister's lives, but still saying, we have it reminds me of the Little Women, Jo March's speech. Women, we have thoughts and we have feelings and we have desires and we have dreams, and there are things we want to do, and we shouldn't be disallowed from doing them just because we happen to be born women. I thought that was such a radically strong statement. I loved it. And like, Jane does have her moments of delulu. She has her what if Mr. Rochester and I kissed moments. Like, she's not completely like a liberated woman, but also thinking just throughout the novel, one of the most quoted lines, which I think I already mentioned maybe in our last episode, but I love it so much. I am no bird and no net ensnares me. It's just so radical for the time. Also, another thing to note that I think makes this narrative in particular so compelling and so interesting, both as this really fun story that we've loved for generations, but also as a technical work of literature, is the fact that it is presented as an autobiography. So, narratively, within the story, Jane Eyre is saying, I am writing this story, and it is a true account of what happened to me exactly as my life has played out. At the very beginning of chapter 10, she says, hitherto I recorded in detail the events of my insignificant existence. For the first 10 years of my life, I have given almost as many chapters. But this is not to be a regular autobiography. I am only bound to invoke memory where I know her responses will possess some degree of interest. Therefore, I now pass a space of 8 years, like you were saying, Nadea. She skips 8 years, almost in silence. A few lines only are necessary to keep up the links of connection. And I think that's so fascinating to think about how the framing of Jane Eyre as an autobiography, how that affects how that affects the ways in which we're interpreting the story. And I think it's so interesting that she says, I am only bound to invoke memory where I know her responses will possess some degree of interest. So, in some way, she is manipulating the story to invoke a certain reader response, which brings up the question, is she a reliable narrator? Are we trusting her account of events? The last time I read this book, it was for a class, and we spoke at length about whether or not we thought Jane was a reliable narrator. Which I feel like you can make a pretty solid argument either way for this book, but it was really funny to think about because a lot of people were speculating. I bet like, oh shoot, that was a major spoiler. Cut that out. You didn't hear it. You didn't hear it. You didn't hear anything.
Okay.
Um, anyway, a lot of people were speculating that, you know, maybe this was towards the end of Jane's life when she's recounting everything that has happened to her, and it's all just like fan fiction. That after the events of the novel that I will not mention so as to avoid spoiling those of you who have not read it, which is something that I definitely don't want to do, that I have definitely not done at all so far.
Hard saying this a second time. Why would you think that?
Thank you, Nadea, for editing out all of my Freudian slips. um, but people were speculating that after some of the events of the novel, you know, maybe she ran away and like was super delusional about everything that had happened and was like basically writing fan fiction about how her life story had concluded. Um, so it's just really fun, I think, to think about it going forward. Also, in context with what we were talking about, Jane's sort of latching on immediately to, oh my gosh, it's a ghost. There's something supernatural going on. How much of it did she really believe, and how much is she maybe hamming up for the audience? How much is she putting on a show, telling a story? I think that's another really fun sort of gothic element to the novel. And Charlotte Bronte is very, very famous in this work for her really deeply complex psychological take on Jane's character, the way that she writes her as a protagonist and as a narrator. It's good fun. It's good fun for sure.
I think I trust Jane as a narrator just because it feels like she's poking fun at herself a bit, like past self. And I feel like for me at least as a reader, that lends the novel, I think, like a sense of authenticity almost, I guess, that she recognizes that some of what she used to think is dramatic and a little bit delusional. But it feels very honest in that way.
So she is a little bit delusional. I'm wondering, how ugly is Mr. Rochester, really?
Yeah, so we definitely did digress a little bit from our summary, but I think we talked about chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 12,
We
chapter
covered everything up through Mr. Rochester being there,
Mhm.
and then getting to that gothic moment where, okay, so we need to pick up back at the ghostly demonic laugh at Jane's keyhole.
Yeah,
So then what happens that night, that evening, after she's had this really creepy ghostly experience?
crazy. She's trying to lay down and she can't. Like she's trying to go to bed and she can't sleep because she keeps hearing this ghostly demonic laugh. And she thinks it's or she's told beforehand, I think, that it's the laugh of one of the other servants, correct?
She's told afterwards. So she and Mr. Rochester have a conversation, and he says that it's Grace Poole, who is one of the servants at Thornfield Estate. And she's really mysterious. She keeps to herself. She's always going up into the attic for some mysterious reason.
Yeah, and so Jane hears this spooky laughter, and then she goes into the hall, I believe, to investigate, and then there's smoke coming out of Mr. Rochester's room. And she goes in to see why there's smoke rolling out in clouds from his room. And there's a fire and she has to like throw a bunch of water and he's like asleep and won't wake up and she's like throw a bunch of water on him to like put out the fire and she saves his life.
So
Which
romantic.
I know is so romantic. And he goes on a whole spiel about how big a deal this is. Because she seems, or he thinks at least, that she seems very dismissive of this. Because she just kind of saves his life and then is ready to just leave. And he's like, no, 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 come back. you just saved my life. Can we like at least shake hands or something? I think was the line. Which I found really funny.
Yeah, and then they shake hands really awkwardly, and it's like at the end of a first date when you kind of don't know what to do, and you're like, do I give you a little hug now? I really don't want to, but like, does social expectation dictate that I must? Or, do we skip that part? Do we just go in for the handshake? What about a high five?
Also, she like tries like there because he like holds her hand basically. It's the line is he held out his hand, I gave him mine. He took it first in one, then in both his own. And then a little bit like later down the page for me, he's like still holding her hand, and he says, "Go, Jane, go." And then the narration says, "But he still retained my hand, and I could not free it." And I think that's really. He's like, "You can go," but he's still holding on to her. So if I were Jane, I'd be very delulu about that. I would think he was in love with me. He doesn't want me to go.
Blue about that. I, however, would be so freaked out.
He's definitely odd. Odd, very good word to
He's a little
describe.
freak.
He's he's just a little freak. Um,
Who's gonna match my freak? That was
what?
chapter 16. No, that was 15. And then 16 happens, and 16 is kind of boring. Um, isn't in 16 he just like disappears, and Jane is being mopey about it, and she's like, but I'm so in love with him. Like, girl, you haven't known him a month.
Yeah, don't
I,
know that
I think
man.
that I'm actually maybe what I'm learning about myself in this vlog filming session is that I am just a horrible cynic when it comes to romance, which could also be true.
Mhm. I would say so. Um, but like you're also romantic.
I'm such a romantic in
Oh,
my head, but then I'm like, nobody must ever know. Like, nobody can know that I want to be loved.
no one can know that I want to be
Guys, it's okay. I swear I'm working on it in therapy
at 4 o'clock today.
later today. Anyway, I'm gonna let you continue and stop interrupting with needless asides that talk about my love life or lack of it.
No, I love your asides,
They're gonna be
but
so goofy. I don't know, like I feel like we just need to keep the people entertained.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like it can't be all recap and
mhm.
no fun.
Especially not when chapter 16 was a little boring
Yeah,
because
chapter
Jane,
same.
she wakes up and she's like, I need to talk to Mr. Rochester about last night. Um,
He's gone.
and he's not there to talk to. Mr. Rochester brings back a bunch of rich people,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they come to Thornfield to hang out and be rich and wealthy and stuff. And Jane is hiding out with Adele, because she does not feel kind of fit to socialize with like all these elegant people, and she thinks it's best if she just stays out of the way. Um, but Mr. Rochester insists that she come and make herself present. Um, and then she does so, and then she tries to leave really quickly, and he's like, no, 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 come back. So there's that whole thing too. But we meet a lot of new characters in the last chapter.
And there are only a couple who are really important. So who's the big player that we meet?
So there's a Mrs. Ashton, and there's a Lady Lynn, and there's a Mrs. Colonel Dent. But the most important of the guests are the Dowager Lady Ingram and her daughters Blanche and Mary.
So Blanche Ingram and Mr. Rochester are getting their flirt on, and Jane is super jealous. So we know that Blanche and her mom and her sister, they're these socialites, kind of gold diggish as they're implied to be. And Jane is like, oh my gosh, what if he's in love with her? They would make such a perfect match. They would look so good together. They would make so much sense. And she's also like 25. So they kind of wouldn't because he's fully in his 40s. But then again, Jane is like 18. So it's better than that, I guess. But we also know that Blanche and her mother are really rude to Jane over these dinners, events, what have you. They're really stuck up, snobbish, spoiled, rich, and they make Jane feel pretty bad about herself.
Yeah, the wealthy people are kind of in general rude.
We conclude chapter 17 with another little romantic moment between Jane and Mr. Rochester. And she's crying, she's sad, she's just upset. These parties have really taken a toll on her constitution. And he's saying, well, I'll let you go tonight, like a jerk. But understand that so long as my visitors stay, I expect you to appear in the drawing room every evening. It is my wish. Don't neglect it. Now go and send Sophie for Adele. Good night, my. And then he drops off. He stopped, bit his lip, and abruptly left me. So, this definitely feeds into Jane's Delulu state of mind. What was he going to say? Was he going to say, my dear, my love, my darling, my Jane? What do you
I
think?
like the my itself. It's like my, I'm yours. Like there's something there. So
It's a little bit romantic. I have to give him that. I mean, I am
it's like so awkward. Like
strongly anti-Rochester, however.
just call me my love, my dear, my darling. But he says my and then runs.
That's kind of cute. Like, that's kind of endearing. Like, maybe I kind of get it a little bit. Like, I would personally get the ick later, but, like, in that moment, wait a minute, got me giggling, kicking my feet.
The romantic in you.
The romantic in me. My two wolves inside me, staunch romantic, staunch cynic. They're always at war. All right, so that was the last, I think, 8 chapters we read. What are your thoughts? What are your opinions, Nadea? What do you think?
I have I just can't stop thinking about how Jane keeps calling Mr. Rochester ugly. That's just the
Hilarious.
prominent thing on my mind. But I love the kind of woman that she's becoming because she's a little rebellious and she feels very self-aware, which maybe the self-awareness is coming from this like this retrospective kind of view. But I just love her spirit, like her whole women deserve to her like her Little Women speech basically that you recited so lovely for us earlier. But I don't know, I love Jane. She's so fun to read. I love her and her little delulu. See a bit of
She,
myself
but
maybe.
also such a strong character. And so, I think, so secure in herself and her own values and beliefs. And I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes, especially now
Guesses?
Blanche. Um, especially now that we've introduced Blanche. I feel like I don't know. I do wonder if there's something there, or if it's just Jane's kind of jealousy Delulu reading into it. But I feel like for the sake of drama, there's gotta be a little something. It can't be that easy. So I'm excited to see what unfolds, what awaits in chapters 18 through
23.
in chapters 18 through 23.
Which we will be recapping in another vlog episode, June 24th. So be sure to read along with us if that's something you're doing, and definitely tune in, even if you're not, so that you can hear us yap and giggle. Until next time, I've been Sarah.
And I've been Nadea, and we'll see you next week. Happy viewing!
Bye!